What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be discussing the geometry of street photography. And so I've been practicing street photography for the past decade, traveling the world, and I've mastered the art of composition. And I'm really eager to share with you some of the advice and tips I have along this video, as I believe a lot of street photographers struggle with composition, as this is something that comes very secondarily for us when we're on the streets. But I believe in order to create stronger street photographs, one must synthesize the content within their frame with form. And so life is out of our control, and it's very difficult to put order to the chaos within our frames. But I believe through practice, persistence, and repetition, we can improve our street photography composition. And ultimately, composition derives through your intuition at that gut instinct where you press the shutter. It's very much an intuitive practice, street photography. And as much as we have two eyes that are connected to our brain that allow us to perceive the world with sharp visual acuity, I believe the photograph is a result of our intuitive nature. The photograph, the moment you press the shutter, derives through your gut. And I believe you should allow that gut instinct to guide you when you make the compositional decisions in that moment. And so here at this scene in Jericho, as I climbed the Wadi Kalt mountain range with a group of Palestinian men, the car broke down and I had to respond very quickly and allow my gut instinct to guide me. And what I do is, when I view a scene, when I'm in the moment and I'm observing life in front of me, I see life as a visual problem for me to solve. And I put together the foreground, middle ground, and background, very similar to this notion of visual problem solving, or, it's like I'm solving a visual puzzle, okay? And so essentially, the compositional decision that I made very instinctively and intuitively as this moment occurred very quickly was include the car in the foreground. And so by including this first element in the foreground, I'm breaking the frame up and filling 1/3 of the frame. Not only am I adding this layer and depth to the image, but I'm adding visual interest through the formalities of the shape. And so as you follow your eye throughout the frame, you reveal these Palestinian men, and the car is broken down, and we have the second element in the frame here. And we have that mountain range that fills the middle ground of the frame. And then as your eye travels to the back, of course, we have the mountain range. And so we have three simple elements that create this composition. But it was my intuition in that fraction of a second, that split moment decision for me to include the car in the foreground, to increase the composition's visual interest from a simple and flat moment of some men near a car to an elevated photograph with shape, form, and strong content. And so sometimes simple things like light and shadow intrigue me and is enough to get me to make some photographs. And here at this scene in the bus stop in Philadelphia, my hometown, I made a photograph here as much as I'm looking at life as this visual puzzle and trying to put together order within the frame, I sometimes do it differently, and it's very much intuitive. And so in the previous image, you saw me plug that foreground element in. And so that's my first decision. Now with this photograph, it's something a little bit different. And so we're going to break down exactly how this was made. And so as I observed the light and shadow play, I found myself intrigued, and I could sense the possibility of a photograph to be made. However, the thing that anchored me in, and the reason why I pressed the shutter at this moment, and the reason why things are aligned in this particular way, is because of the way I honed in on this element on the left-hand side of the frame. And so that circular sign that I just highlighted in yellow on the left-hand side of the frame is what I used to guide my compositional decision here. And so essentially, that was the first compositional decision I made, was including that sign in the background, which may seem odd. However, by positioning that element in the frame in a very particular way, the middle ground and foreground aligned perfectly how I wanted them to be. And so the light intrigued me, and the way that this man was coming in and out of the shadow intrigued me. And so this was the second element that I plugged in the frame, observing the man in the foreground and how I could include the light on that wall there in the foreground emphasizes the way in which light and shadow give form and shape to this particular moment. And then finally, all I really needed to do was wait for that man to come straight into the center of my frame and press the shutter at that instinctual moment. And this is how this composition was made, through positioning certain things in certain ways, by recognizing the puzzle and solving it through anchoring that element on the left-hand side of the frame, working from back to front. And so sometimes you respond quickly. You add the foreground element instinctually. Other times, you're fishing, you're observant of your background and setting a stage. And this is an opportunity that I chose to share with you on how I essentially work from back to front to create these strong photographs with form and content. And so position and perspective is what determines the result of the photograph, where ultimately the photographer is merely responsible for where they position their physical body in relationship to the moment and the background. And so by dropping to a low angle, you can dramatically alter the composition and the impact of your photo by giving the viewer a more pleasant experience where the form and the shape of the gestures are very clear and visible. And so I believe a great composition is easy to read. And here in Zambia, Africa, as I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I woke up early in the morning and caught the sunrise alongside some of my host brothers. And the thing that interested me right off the bat was my host brother, Babwalia, playing against my wall, and you can see the shadow that's casted. And this was something that intrigued me. And so once again, light and shadow play being the visual interest in this picture. However, to make this composition more formally interesting by including the shape in the foreground here of this man's hand and the pole in the background in relationship to that stick adds depth, layer, and more formal interest, where essentially dropping to a low angle and positioning my body in relationship to the hand in the background, you have this clear visual, impactful gesture in the foreground of the frame. And then, of course, in the middle ground, we have the tree that breaks up the composition, using that as another sort of compositional anchor point to break the frame up in thirds. And I decided in that moment that in order to create something more visually dynamic and interesting, I should not only just photograph the boy with the shadow, but to put something in the foreground and to solve that visual puzzle by filling that quarter of the frame with the hand up against that blue sky. And so when you see the world as shapes and you view the life in front of you as a visual puzzle for you to solve, you'll start to see like this. You'll start to make these relationships very intuitively. And so I want to share with you a few more examples breaking down the power of triangles and how when you fill a frame, I believe the goal is to create a visual feast. And by utilizing these different techniques, we can create more impactful photographs. And so here at this scene, I photographed a beautiful moment between two Palestinian men outside of a mosque. However, instead of just photographing these Palestinian men engaging in a kiss, I elevated the frame by filling the background with that man with the cigarette. And so now with the composition, you have three elements to view, and your eye can sort of wander from left to right and back again. And I find this to be a very useful technique to create a more impactful photograph. You know, where these curves and circles, they emerge naturally when you're out there on the street, but it allows the viewer's eye to roam around as you have this visual feast, filling the frame here in Napoli. As I observed these men with watermelon, I found that the watermelon, of course, was visually impactful and interesting with that popping color. But in order for me to create this composition, I used this man that was swimming in the background as my anchor point. And so this is another example of me working back to front. And when I filled the frame, at the moment I pressed the shutter, we have this visual feast from the watermelon and the way in which the composition forms very naturally this spiral shape where your eye goes around in a circle, in a spiral. And this is something very beautiful to have in a photograph, as your eye can travel throughout the frame very intuitively. And you can see here in this photograph, not only do we have a circular shape, but there's also that triangular shape between the three pieces of watermelon. So there's a lot of different elements in this frame formally that make it so impactful. One of the most simple ways in which we can create stronger order and structure within our frames is the use of rectangles and grids. And the rule of thirds is a very simple technique to create a stronger photograph. And I photographed this scene here in Jericho once again and made the very simple compositional decision of positioning the boy on the left-hand side in relationship to the boy on the right-hand side. And I didn't necessarily look at the life in front of me and think that I'm following the rule of thirds. Let me make sure I, position this person directly on the line on that third so that I can break the frame up this way. No, it's something instinctual. You notice that you have two subjects in front of you and you make these relationships. You fill the boy in the foreground on the left-hand side and you allow the background to be filled with the boy on the right-hand side against that beautiful, colorful graffiti wall. And this decision derived through my intuition, solving the visual puzzle on my toes, where the composition becomes textbook, where I followed the rule of thirds perfectly, but it was intuitive and happened naturally. And so leading lines and vanishing points are another way to add visual interest in your frames. It'll add depth, and I find that it'll guide the viewer's eye to something visually interesting. And so here in Baltimore, as I photographed this rainbow, it's a good example of the use of leading lines and the way in which the leading lines reveal this moment of the rainbow that emerges in the background. As you see the sidewalk and the street there fill the frame with this vanishing point at the end that reveals the cherry on top being this decisive moment of the rainbow and the man that's in perfect stride with the umbrella. And so there's something about the use of lines and the vanishing point in the frame that reveals something visually interesting. The rule of thirds is a great technique, but it's also important to realize that if you place something in the center of the frame, it can be just as visually impactful. We're here in Bandra in Mumbai, India. I photographed this interaction between a mother and her daughter as they were playing here at the scene. And what's beautiful about this frame is the use of symmetry. And so when I position these people in the center of the frame, it's broken up perfectly. From the left and the right-hand side, we have the gesture of the hands, the flowing hair, and those two circular sort of wheels that fill the frame in the center. And I find that by putting some subject or moment directly in the center of the frame can work very strongly in a photograph. However, the rule of thirds, it's not necessarily this law that you must follow when you're on the streets and you're following all these rules and guidelines, but you use it simply as a guide, as a way for you to frame things. And I think very intuitively and respond very quickly when I make these decisions on the street. And so, of course, the lineup of this newspaper isn't necessarily perfectly on, the bullet point there on the line with the face of Muhammad Ali, but I use the technique of layering to create form in this composition by positioning that interesting moment between the gesture of the newspaper in relationship to the people on the right-hand side that are eating on that barrier. And I could sense that was the composition to make. I didn't want to just center the man there in the middle of the frame with the newspaper, but I understood my background. I could sense the possibility to layer two different elements together, and I simply positioned the interesting visual moment on the left-hand side in relationship to the girls on the right-hand side. And so it's a very simple technique. The use of the rule of thirds is something I use very frequently, but it's very natural and intuitive. And so another technique is to use frames within a frame. And so here in Mexico City, I framed that worker within the doorway where he is working in relationship to the shape on that mural. And I find that the use of mirrors, the use of doorways and windows can become these natural frames that emphasize and give impact within your frames. And so here in Jericho, I photographed as that boy was playing with that tire there, and I filled the frame by using the window as another formal shape and a way to add depth and layer within this frame. And so I find that practice and just being patient and being persistent at a scene can make or break your street photography. And so I think it's important to, when working at a scene, to allow the moment to develop naturally. And so here at this behind the scenes video, you can see me in Shafat refugee camp in East Jerusalem. And I was initially drawn to the light and shadow and the beautiful popping color of the watermelon. And as I interacted at the scene and had an open and honest and authentic moment, something spontaneous occurred. And so by being there and being patient and being observant and sensing the possibility of a photograph, I was able to create a strong image through my intuition at that instinctual moment to press the shutter as the man rose the watermelon and placed it on top of his head. I had that very quick 5-second window to make this composition. And so I want to highlight here in this video behind the scenes how it's made in real life and practice, where I'm not necessarily taking myself so seriously, and I'm very loose and fluid and responding intuitively. I think it's important to recognize that composition derives through your intuition, and it's important to be there and be present when you press the shutter and not necessarily overly analyze in your head the different compositional decisions you can make. And so I'm very playful on the street. I believe that a playful attitude can help you and can influence the way in which you make photographs. And so I don't take myself seriously when I'm out there, and I like to have fun, where composition is instinctive. It's something that really is going to come down to your intuition and practicing daily. And so I believe that you should go out there and practice, train your eye, and trust your intuition when you're out there making photographs. And remember that life is like solving a visual puzzle. Making a composition is like solving a visual puzzle. And ultimately, what you're responsible for is where you position your physical body in relationship to the subject and the background. And this is how you synthesize content with form. We have one last example here from Bandra Fort in Mumbai, India, and I find that this is the perfect photograph to wrap up this idea of visual problem solving, as in this moment I spent a lot of time photographing during the golden hour here and observed the different patterns of the way the birds were flying and observed the different shapes and the geometric forms that this fort provided for me. But I want to highlight here the very simple technique that I used to create this composition. And while the moment is very much out of my control and we have this interesting moment occur spontaneously, I was able to put order within the chaos through the way in which I position my body in relationship to that moment. And so essentially, when I observed this scene, I was quickly drawn to the way in which this man was interacting with the window on the left-hand side of the frame. And so this is another example of me working back to front, finding an anchor point and angling and positioning my body in relationship to the background. And so firstly, by plugging in that man on the window frame in the left-hand side, I had my anchor point. I had something visually intriguing to work with, and I had my stage set perfectly. And so all I really needed to do was set the middle ground here, or the foreground here, with these women that enter the frame time and time again. And I was patient and persistent at the scene. And I could sense the possibility of this photograph, of this moment, of this bird flying through that frame, using the frame within a frame technique, and using the different shapes and these different techniques together to form this composition through synthesizing that moment, that content, with strong form, with the formalities of composition, by using geometry, and finally completing the frame with that final piece, the piece that solved that visual puzzle for me. And so hopefully, through looking at some of the behind the scenes of my photographs and talking about some of the ideas I have, you can go out there and have a better understanding of how you can create stronger photographs using geometry, shape, and form, as this is something I believe anyone can achieve, but it's going to come down to consistency and practicing and actually taking some of these ideas into the real world, into the arena, into the street, and practicing daily, really. And so, yeah, thank you for watching. Hopefully some of the ideas I made in this video can help you, and yeah, just go out there and shoot, and yeah, stay tuned. More videos on street photography to come. Peace.